Welcome to a brief introduction to high velocity for business use. Now for business, what we encompass here is offices, restaurants, theatres, medical applications, and really anywhere where people, team members or clients are sedentary or sitting for any long periods. Okay, so let's start by talking about what we would normally do in an office application. Now, I'm just going to talk about offices here to demonstrate, but you can extrapolate that out for restaurants and so on. I'm going to talk about open plan offices because they typically have the more problems. Normally, we would put something on the ceiling. Normally, you'd have a cassette, what we call a ceiling cassette. And the ceiling cassette is blowing out air in cooling mode along the ceiling, trying to get a nice wide distribution. The FourWay Diffuser is trying to do the same thing but a little differently. Okay, so all you see is a little diffuser in the ceiling. The difference with the diffuser is that in heating mode it's still the same air pattern, but the cassette, the blades are automatic and they blow downwards in heating because obviously hot air wants to rise, so we try to get the heat down to where we need it. There are some other options with wall mounted systems, but they're typically for smaller areas. So what's the problems with what we're doing? Invariably, somebody is going to be sitting in the airstream, and they're going to feel a draft. So that's the biggest complaint, is just cold drafts. Because even if it's warm air, by the time it gets to you and touches your skin, it's going to be below your skin temperature. It's going to feel maybe not cold, but certainly not warm. So it's a discomfort. It's also a distraction, and that's something that generates probably the most complaints. The second real problem we get is that the distribution of the heat. Typically, the cold air drops, the warm air rises. So in cooling mode, the cold air will drop and gather and build up as layers. In heating, the warm air wants to rise, and again, the colder air drops and it builds up. Okay? Now, that can represent itself by people having cold feet. Typically, maybe ladies with bare ankles. Receptionists can have a terrible time of it with the cold air coming in under the door. But right across an open plan area, we do see this hot air rising, cold air dropping. So that's the first problem. Drafts and temperature variation. Now you will get this temperature variation also along the floor plan of the office. So depending on where these cooling systems are positioned, some areas are just going to be cooler than other areas. Okay. So that's what we normally do. So how do we get over the problem? Okay, here's the introduction to high velocity. So what are we doing different? Well, basically, this is what we're doing. We'll have numbers of small outlets in the ceiling. And these outlets can be positioned what we call out of the traffic. So not blowing directly on anybody. And the air is coming down like this in a column. Now, let's talk about cold air in cooling mode rather than warm air in heating mode. It'll give a better description. So this area is at a negative pressure. Okay? So why is it at a negative pressure? It's at a negative pressure because it's moving. And the quicker it moves, the bigger the negative pressure. Okay? So being at a lower pressure than the room air wants to go over here and join it. So you get these little eddies forming like this, and these big eddies forming like this. So you get a very, very slow movement of air like this. A little bit like the London Eye. It's moving, but you just can't tell. So what that does then is it takes where you would normally have hot air up there and cold air down here. It just mixes that air beautifully, so we get lovely even temperatures, float the ceiling. So we avoid what people sometimes refer to as cold toes, warm nose. Also, because it's doing it in this way, we don't get those hot and cold spots throughout the office. You don't get an area where people are cooler or warmer than any other area. So we get a nice even temperature, float the ceiling, wall to wall. And because we're inducing the air, sometimes called an induction system, we're inducing the air. So this outlet here would typically be maybe up against a wall, not with somebody sitting, maybe around a pillar, or maybe it's in a bulkhead and it's blowing, use the same colour, it's blowing across the ceiling. Okay? Now, if that was a normal air conditioning system, what would happen is that cold air would drop. Okay? And somebody's going to feel a draft. With this system, again, what's happening here, we're just creating this lovely slow induction. Okay, so whether we're blowing out this way or down that way, or indeed up from the floor, works exactly the same. So what you end up with is an even temperature throughout, no hot spots, no cold spots, and nobody sitting in a draft. So that's a brief introduction as to why somebody might want to use a high velocity system in a commercial application. My name is Joe Flanagan. This is the Ingenious Air company, and we just want to help you make the right decision about your air conditioning.